Chapter 11. It was around 3 in the afternoon when the decision was finally made to visit the grounds of the Adherents of the Divine Winds. Eckhart was convinced there was still something hidden there, something waiting to be uncovered, even if he couldn't yet name it. He reminded himself of how these things usually unfolded in his old life. Start with small, almost trivial questions, just enough to test the truthfulness of whoever stood across from him. Then, piece by piece, press harder. Challenge their story, watch them fumble. He lived for that moment when the facade began to splinter, the backtracking, the sudden stammering, the nervous dart of the eyes. He always sensed it just before the first crack appeared, and the anticipation stirred something electric in him. Eckhart had always despised attorneys who asked too many open-ended questions. To him, asking a deponent why they did or thought something was a kind of depositional suicide. A few could pull it off, but he never tried. Not once. He considered himself an expert in redirection. His strategy was to guide witnesses down a path where the facts they offered would eventually collide with other facts. These conflicts didn't always reveal themselves immediately. Often they were subtle, embedded in carefully crafted questions that few even noticed were traps. His favorite moments came when fraudsters were questioned about restaurant expenses. They always remembered what they ate, but never who they dined with. "So, you remember what you had for dinner, but you can't remember who was there," he would ask. The silence that followed was delicious. He could see them calculating, searching for an answer, and panic inevitably creeping in. He always made a point to remind the viewers how much time had passed between the deposition and the events being described. None of it broke the rules. This was, as he liked to say, real lawyering, and he loved it. There was a practical edge to his technique as well. By knocking a witness off balance and making them appear uncredible, he sent a clear signal to the opposing side. Take this to trial, and you might lose everything. 9 times out of 10, it worked. Despite being disbarred, Eckhart's mind was still wired to think like an attorney. He suspected most professions left similar imprints on those who practiced them. He tried to stay mindful of that whenever conflict arose with someone new. His days of sparring with worthy opponents were long gone, though he had on occasion crossed swords with medical professionals, and they were the worst. In his experience, they carried themselves as if exempt from the law, hiding behind jargon, credentials, and a veneer of ethical superiority. They were the experts, and he most definitely was not. After 1 or 2 bruising encounters with them in the courtroom, he shifted his focus entirely. He became a settling machine. But none of that mattered anymore. In the business deals that Sides and he managed, there was little intellectual combat at all. On the real estate side, workers simply did as they were told. With the market still climbing, setting a price was a simple calculation. Ask slightly above what's reasonable, and the buyer will negotiate down to your target. Even the rare investigative work they took on relied less on theatrics and more on raw leverage. Damning information, no matter how ugly, was enough to topple someone's life and livelihood. And the threat of that collapse remained one of the most powerful negotiation tools he had ever known. As Eckhart drove through the university district, his mind wandered to the conversations he might soon have with the adherents. He took a certain comfort in the fact that he'd never once been involved in any case against a religious organization. The closest he had come was more than 2 decades ago, during his first year of law school, when he worked part-time as a clerk in a small firm. One Saturday, he'd been called in to help set up camera equipment and prepare documents for the local Catholic bishop representing the diocese. His employer wanted to avoid a media circus and arranged for Bishop Meinrad to testify about the sex abuse crisis, specifically 2 priests who had been quietly reassigned to local parishes from out of state. The deposition lasted 4 hours, long enough to make Eckhart question whether he even wanted to pursue a career in law. Some of the answers from that day still echoed in his mind now and then. Back in the present, he felt two nagging qualms about wherever today's conversations might lead. With no formal rules to follow, he could dive straight into challenges without establishing any baseline facts, and he found that strangely liberating. Besides, the odds were slim that anyone he met this afternoon would recognize the logical fallacies he was about to wield. He rehearsed his approach in his head, launched with direct questions, quick and unthreatening. "What's your name? What do you do here? What do you know about Alfonso Silva?" Then, without warning, dropped the torpedo. Eckhart was quietly worried about Sides. Something had happened 2 days before this trip, something neither of them could explain. Truth be told, Eckhart hadn't been fully paying attention when it started. All he remembered was a sudden blur in his peripheral vision, a jumbled mass flying toward him. Sides' body slammed into the table with a deafening crash. The boom of the impact sent Eckhart lurching from his seat. In a rush, he grabbed Sides under the arms and dragged him a few feet clear of the wreckage, patting his face and calling his name. When Sides finally stirred, his words were disjointed, ramblings about clouds and strange sounds. That was when Eckhart noticed the figurine on the floor, knocked from its perch. At first, he didn't connect the two events, but instinct made him pick it up using a handkerchief. Later that evening, he handed the wrapped object back to Sides, who examined it briefly, then tucked it into his pocket without saying a word. Whatever Sides experienced had left its mark. His left hand was now all but useless. He couldn't fully close it, couldn't hold or even cup a firearm. Most people wouldn't notice. After all, most were right-handed and favored that side for nearly everything. But Eckhart saw the difference in the smallest details, the fumbling when trying to text, the awkwardness at a keyboard, the way Sides avoided using utensils in his left hand. When entertaining clients, they even chose restaurants where a meal could be managed one-handed. Eckhart noticed other things too, little habits Sides might not have even been aware of. When tense, Sides often raised his left hand above his shoulder in a deflective posture. Because of his injury, he could no longer throw a jab or a proper hook with that hand. Instead, he would press his fingers together, shaping the hand into a rigid spear. With his forearm locked, he could still deflect incoming blows. Eckhart had seen him use it one night when a furious husband tried to attack him at their office across town. Sides intercepted 2 strikes with quick, sharp movements of his left hand before springing from his chair. Then came a wild haymaker to the man's face, followed by an equally wild left elbow strike. The fight ended there. Eckhart had to call an ambulance. It wasn't Sides' ability to defend himself that worried Eckhart. He had developed a strange, effective hybrid style of brawling that worked around his disability. What concerned him was the psychological cost. Those over-the-shoulder motions with his hardened hand weren't just reflexes, they were instinctive shields, born of some deeper unease. Sides often tried to disguise them, brushing his raised hand back through his hair as if casually combing it. Eckhart saw through the charade, but neither man ever called it out. Eckhart was so deep in thought that he didn't even realize he was making each turn automatically, as if he had driven this route every day for years. He turned down another street, still lost in the swirl of bizarre facts surrounding the case. He didn't glance at the houses or trees sliding past his windows. The neighborhood was almost unnervingly picturesque. Each street a showcase of manicured lawns and stately homes. It was the kind of place that Hollywood would use to brand the ideal of American success. Here lived the people who had listened carefully in class, earned the degrees that led to high salaries, and married others who had done the same. Together, they'd built comfortable, cultured lives, urban elites, managers of the city in every sense. Eckhart slowed at a stop sign just as his navigation instructed him to turn right. The map showed their destination ahead on the right-hand side. He followed the final prompt, but immediately noticed the police. The Adherents compound wasn't fully visible from their position, but the flashing presence was unmistakable. Wanting to stay inconspicuous, Eckhart eased the car to a stop alongside the sidewalk near the corner home. He inside sat in silence, the engine idling softly. A lone officer stood on the sidewalk, hands folded below his navel, scanning the area with a sharp, deliberate intensity, as though expecting trouble in this otherwise serene neighborhood. No one else was around. The officer's gaze flicked toward their car, meeting their eyes briefly before sliding away, his expression unreadable. Eckhart and Sides tracked the officer's every move. He turned in place several times, scanning the quiet street as if expecting something to stir. Then, he shifted his focus away from them, presenting only the back of his head. There was a pause before his left hand pressed against the radio receiver clipped to his right shoulder. He tilted his head toward it, and even from behind, they could see his mouth moving. Whatever he was saying was lost to them, but the brief clipped responses made it clear someone was speaking back. After a few moments, he released the receiver and started toward the compound, vanishing behind the western wall. When he returned, he was guiding a man in front of him, hands cuffed tightly behind his back. One of the officer's hands gripped the chain of the cuffs, while the other steered him toward the squad car. The man was young, dressed in one of the white clergyman suits Eckhart and Sides had discussed with Brian over breakfast just days earlier. He was openly distraught, sobbing and pleading as the officer kept him moving. Sides let out an incredulous smirk, shaking his head as the man boo-hooed all the way to the cruiser. At the car, the officer ducked his head slightly, guiding the man inside and securing his safety belt. There was a brief, inaudible exchange before the officer closed the door with a firm click, leaving the man locked in the back seat. Then the officer returned to the sidewalk, posture taut, eyes scanning once more. Just then, another man, significantly older than the others, stepped onto the sidewalk, emerging from behind the compound's western wall. He slipped an unlit cigar into his mouth, then pulled it free to hold between his index and middle fingers. Pointing toward someone still hidden from view, he shouted something indistinct and threw his hands up in disbelief. He shrugged at the first officer and began walking toward him, only to whirl back around and start shouting again at whoever remained behind the wall. A moment later, a short Asian man in a black clergyman's suit appeared. His face was twisted with anger as he yelled aggressively at both officers. In the car, Eckhart and Sides leaned forward, eyes locked on the confrontation, though neither could make out the words being exchanged. "Wait a minute," Sides muttered. "I think, yes." "What?" Eckhart asked, still leaning forward but now glancing at him. "I'm pretty sure that's Weber," Sides said, studying the man's features. "Who?" "Al Weber, as in Detective Al Weber." "Really?" Eckhart turned back toward the scene, scrutinizing the older man. By then, the Asian man had shifted his shouting toward the handcuffed man in the cruiser. He cupped one hand around his mouth to project his voice, firing off several sharp phrases. The older man with the cigar moved toward him with slow, deliberate steps. At once, the clergyman faltered, retreating as the imposing man closed the distance. The cigar man swept his hands in a dismissive, swatting motion, driving the smaller man back toward the compound. With a final shrug, the older man stood his ground while the clergyman disappeared behind the western wall. "I don't know. I feel like that's him, but I can't be sure," Sides said. "I don't know that I've ever seen him in person." "It could be, though," Eckhart replied. "Weber? Jesus, that guy's a dedicated prowler. If he's looking into this, we can kiss the money goodbye. Maybe that's his suspect now, in the back of the car." "You think so?" "That guy sure didn't look like someone capable of murder." "Yeah, but you never know," Sides said. "You never know," Eckhart echoed. They watched as the man with the cigar climbed into an unmarked cruiser and sped off. Moments later, the police cruiser pulled forward, swung into a nearby driveway and turned around. As it passed them, they caught a glimpse of the handcuffed man, still crying uncontrollably in the back seat. The cruiser accelerated toward the stop sign and disappeared down the street. They waited until even the sound of the engine faded before Eckhart switched off the ignition. The two exchanged a quick glance, then opened their doors in unison. Walking shoulder to shoulder, they covered 3 lots until they reached the western wall that had blocked their view. Beyond it, the grounds of the compound unfolded in unexpected beauty. A matching eastern wall ran parallel, both lined with perfectly trimmed hedges. The lawn was immaculate, and a crisp concrete path led from the sidewalk to the wide front porch. The path skirted well-kept flower beds and flanked the porch's generous expanse. On the eastern side wall, a driveway ended at an iron gate, locked and barring access to the rear. The compound itself had a minimalist majesty, its clean lines softened by vibrant blooms and precise landscaping. Sides and Eckhart found themselves slowing, eyes drawn to the tiny perfections, the carefully edged flower beds, the symmetry of the shrubs. They were so absorbed by these details that neither man realized they had already stepped onto the porch, approaching the heavy, finely crafted front door. Before they could even knock, the door swung open. A young man stepped out, dressed in a crisp white clergyman suit. He was unnervingly thin, almost sickly so, and wore white gloves, his hands clasped together as he offered a serene smile to the 2 men on the porch. His jet-black hair and equally dark eyes sharpened his gaunt features, making him look even younger than he already appeared. Early 20s at most, Eckhart thought. He still had time to grow into himself. Behind him, just inside the doorway, Eckhart caught sight of the furious Asian man in the black suit, the same one who had been shouting moments earlier. As the young clergyman stepped out and eased the door shut, Eckhart and the man in black locked eyes through the narrowing gap, each tilting their heads slightly to maintain the connection until the door latched. "My name is Blooming Flower," the young man said softly, "but call me John if it makes you more comfortable." "Mr. Flower, John," Eckhart stammered, pressing a hand to his forehead. This was the conversation he'd been waiting for all day, and already he felt off balance. What he'd just witnessed, this eerie calm in contrast to the chaos before, was extraordinary, and he needed to get his bearings. He drew in a breath and studied the figure before him. John remained still, smiling, hands clasped tightly to his chest, nodding once as if to affirm his willingness to answer to his Christian name. Eckhart's mind raced, questions tangling in his throat. Nothing coherent surfaced. Finally, frustrated, he glanced sideways at Sides, silently asking for help. "It's John?" Sides asked. "Sure," John replied with a polite nod. "John, we just saw something crazy out here. What was all that about?" Sides gestured toward the street where the arrest had taken place. "Yes. I'm so sorry you had to witness that," John said, his tone softening. "It's very unfortunate. We're not entirely sure why Brother Haidt was taken into custody." "Brother Haidt?" Sides repeated, nudging Eckhart with his elbow. "Yes, Brother Haidt," John confirmed, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "I'm afraid so." Eckhart smiled faintly. He slipped a small notepad from his jacket pocket and jotted the name down, underlining it twice. He knew John wasn't supposed to say that. This kid was more accustomed to chatting with curious students, not fielding pointed questions. Sides seemed to sense it too. They both suspected John had been sent out to stall while the man in black retreated deeper into the compound. "What happened?" Sides pressed. I'm sorry," John stammered. "What happened to Brother Haidt? Why was he taken in?" "Oh, Brother Haidt," John's voice dropped lower. "To be completely honest, gentlemen, we're not really sure. I'm sure you can imagine we're very sensitive about this sort of thing. It's never happened before." "Never?" Eckhart challenged, his tone sharp. "As far as I know," John replied, shrinking slightly. His nerves were showing now. "Listen," Sides cut in. "We're investigators looking into the death of Alfonso Silva." John audibly gasped. Eckhart caught it instantly and rose onto the tips of his toes, craning his neck as if trying to peer through the narrow glass of the front door. John took a step back, his hands lifting instinctively in a defensive posture. Uncertainty flickered across his face. He didn't know whether to block their view or retreat deeper inside. Fear crept in as the two men edged forward, and he knew there was no way he could stop them if they chose to push past him. John murmured, his voice barely a breath. "Who's that man back there?" Eckhart barked, his voice suddenly harsh and loud. That's who?" Sides demanded, leaning in. Cardinal, like a bird?" Eckhart snapped, feigning a reach for the door. "Cardinal when?" John blurted, grabbing the handle behind him and planting himself firmly against the wood. His body shielded the door as he shook just slightly from fear. His left hand rose again, trembling in a defensive gesture, waving them back in small, quick motions. Eckhart and Sides both watched the wavering hand, knowing full well they could force their way in if they chose. But now wasn't the time. Whatever lay beyond that door, they weren't ready for it. They exchanged a look, then eased back, letting the tension hang as they stepped away from the porch. "Cardinal Wen, Brother Haidt," Eckhart said slowly, emphasizing each name as if tasting them. The young man shrank back even as they began retreating from the porch. Two important names, handed over too easily. A more seasoned gatekeeper would have held them back or buried them in vagueness. Eckhart and Sides both felt a twinge of pity for him. He looked like the runt of a litter, clinging to the door handle with all the authority he could muster. As they stepped off the porch and turned toward the path, John stayed rigid, knuckles white against the handle. Sides chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as he turned away. "Cardinal Wen, Brother Haidt," Eckhart repeated, louder this time, his voice edged with mockery. He laughed softly as they set foot on the concrete path. They glanced back one more time. The young man still clung to the door, eyes wide, watching them as if expecting them to turn back. Only when they crossed onto the sidewalk did he finally release the handle. Instinctively, they kept walking. Sides cast a final look over his shoulder. John now stood at the edge of the porch, hands clasped tight against his chest, his mouth hanging open in disbelief as the two men disappeared beyond the western wall.